his words were, he was in crisis. People in crisis do crazy things. He wants you to think the crazy thing was going to California. Perhaps the crazy thing was killing his 2 children. That's what the evidence has shown he'd done. He told Father Foley he did it. He told Detective Briner he did it in every roundabout way. He said he killed his children. Not one time in any of the conversations that he had with the detectives that testified did he ever say it was accidental. Do you think when somebody does something, they're always going to say that they intended to do it, whether they did or not? Do you think they're always going to come right out and say, yep, I intended to do it? Detective Briner, I did this with deliberate, purposeful, and premeditated malice. No. Nobody's going to say that. And they don't have to say that. There's no magic words that he has to say for you to find that he did it purposely and with deliberate and premeditated malice. In fact, one of the instructions is on intent that you get to look at all of the circumstances. You get to look at the surrounding circumstances. And what are the surrounding circumstances we have here? Adam called in sick. Adam took the kids to the park. Adam then has the FaceTime call with Mary. Mr. Striggins indicated that he went to the bank first. No. Not according to the timeline. The bank was after he talked to Mary, after he was flat and emotionless. Then he goes to the bank to get the money to go to California. He had a plan. He executed that plan. In executing that plan, he executed his children. Now, you are going to get these instructions, and there was the phrase cause of death was mentioned. You will see nowhere in here, not a single page, will the phrase cause of death be on the jury instructions. Because it's not something the state has to prove. They don't have to prove the cause of death. They just have to prove that he killed them, and he did it purposely and with deliberate and premeditated malice. Now, cause of death can help determine intent, and it can help determine premeditation. You heard Dr. Berg talk up here about sometimes with autopsies you have a gunshot wound, you have a stab wound, obvious things. They can help answer those questions. But it's not necessary, and it's not required. But let's talk about Dr. Berg's cause of death. A lot was talked about toxins and poisons, and the failure to test things. Right? I think by now you all have figured out what is reality is not like what you see on TV. What happens in court here is not like what you see on TV. And what happens with pathologists and investigators is not what you see on TV. You don't have 30 minutes to grab everything, do the autopsy, submit all the testing, get a printout of what everything is, and then you get the closing credits. That's not how it works. Sure, there's lots of things that could have been done. Were they reasonable to do? Dr. Berg never said, I need these items tested. He never said that. Detective Holmes said, I want to test these, I'm thinking about sending these for testing, and Dr. Berg, because the emails, he was shown the emails. Dr. Berg acknowledged, keep me updated on that, if you hear something on the testing. Detective Holmes didn't decide to not test stuff because it was inconvenient. Okay, you heard. In order to test these items, you had to tell the lab what to look for. You can't just send it in and say, give me the universe of possibilities. And they didn't know what to test for. Now, they were trying to figure out what's reasonable, and you heard about the conversations that Detective Holmes had with Dr. Berg, where they talked about various things. Is it worth testing this, right? One of the things that was brought up was the volatile gas panel. And Mr. Striggins acknowledged, and Dr. Berg acknowledged, he made a mistake in his deposition when he said that that had been done on Emily Price. And he explained that because the lab result he did have had a little portion that indicated a volatility. But it wasn't the volatile gas count. He made a mistake. It happens. But he talked about why you can't test for the volatile gases. Because they dissipate very rapidly. You know, there was a list of items here that weren't tested or supposedly weren't tested. We know that's not true. One of them was the taro ant box. Remember that? This item wasn't tested. But remember, I showed Dr. Berg that box. I said, can you see the active ingredients on that box? Yes, I can. What's the active ingredient? Borax. What is contained in borax? Boron. What did Dr. Berg indicate testing had been done on Emily Price's blood? Boron. So they did do testing. They looked at what was reasonable to test, and they tested those things. Freon was mentioned. You heard Detective Holm. You know, Mary thought that maybe she had smelled Freon a month afterwards. But Detective Holm was in there within the week. He didn't smell any Freon. The air conditioning was working and the refrigerator was working, right? Chloroform. People were asked, why didn't we test for chloroform? Well, you heard Dr. Berg's testimony. He told you chloroform, the usual manner or method of administration would be to soak a rag and put it on someone's face. But what did he say? It doesn't matter if there's chloroform on it, because the chloroform isn't going to kill the kids. They're going to die first from the rag covering their face and smothering them before they're going to die from the chloroform. So, knowing whether there was chloroform doesn't matter. It's not reasonable. So if we were going to test for chloroform, they were going to consume the sample. And then if another reasonable thing popped up, they wouldn't be able to test it. And then Mr. Striggins would be up here saying, look, they tested all this stuff, and then this new thing came up, and they didn't have a sample to test. It's a classic catch-22. They're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't, so they have to make a reasonable decision on what is worth testing, because you've got to get it right. It's not a matter of we don't know, it's a matter of we want to get it right. We want to be sure, because we recognize we have a limited sample. We recognize we have a limited shot to get this. And Detective Holm, looking at this stuff and asking these questions, it wasn't him questioning the cause of death. Not at all. Because you'll recall Dr. Berg talked about with the asphyxia by smothering. And we talked about the abrasion. And you're not necessarily going to have an abrasion if there's asphyxia by smothering. And he talked about some of the factors that affect that. The size of the individual being smothered. The level of consciousness of the individual being smothered. Whether they struggled in the context of the level of consciousness. And Dr. Berg said there's a number of substances that can infect one's level of consciousness. Perhaps that's why investigators were trying to figure out if there was a substance that might explain why Teddy didn't have the abrasion, but Emily did. That might explain perhaps there was a substance given that caused them to have a lesser state of consciousness that made it easier for him to smother them. Now that brings me to the DNA. We didn't even talk about that, but it fits in here. You heard the DNA analyst get up here and tell you about the numbers. And from a number standpoint, most of those stats were fairly low, like under 100, within a few hundreds. But Emily's one hand, it was like 676 million, right? But her other hand wasn't so much. And Melissa Felixo told you that the stat directly correlates to the amount of DNA. And the amount of DNA correlates to the amount of cells, the quantity, right? And she talked about how DNA is deposited and transferred and touched with the touch DNA, and how somebody can touch something and somebody else can come touch it. They may pick it up, they may not. She talked about how it's not uncommon to swab fingernails, and the reason she said the fingernails is she said you typically swab the fingernails for signs of struggle. Under the fingernails for signs of struggle. Dr. Berg said Emily had an abrasion. Her one hand had high number, which meant there was a larger quantity of cells from which she could detect DNA. Perhaps Emily wasn't as unconscious as Teddy when she was smothered, and she fought back. And that explained her abrasion, and that might explain why perhaps her hand touched her father, and that accounts for the more cells and the larger number of DNA. Now, another thing brought up was, that Adam said there was no planning, okay? All right, again, are we always going to take his word for it? Think about it. This is the guy who went to Father Foley and said his name's Jimmy. I mean, we know that he lied at certain points. It doesn't mean everything he said was a lie. But you'll recall, both of the detectives said, whenever they got to asking him the really hard stuff, he'd shut down. Not shut down, he'd deflect, he'd change the subject. So it's not unreasonable that he's not going to come right out and admit it. He's not going to say he had a plan. But again, it doesn't matter whether he says he had a plan. You have to look at the circumstances. And the circumstances show he had a plan. And he executed that plan. And in executing that plan, he executed Emily and Teddy. There was some conversation about his statements with police and whether they were voluntary and how he may have gone silent or not answered certain questions, and how you can't find that it's voluntary based on that. He has a right to remain silent. But there was no evidence that he remained silent and then stopped and didn't say anything. He had periods of silence, and then he would re-engage, and he would answer questions. So you don't get to say, hey, I was silent, but then I re-engaged and answered questions, but you can't consider that. If he chooses to talk, which he did to the investigators, then his words and what he says are fair game. He can't have it both ways. Mr. Striggins brought up the fact that I had, in closing, made some comments about wanting you to think some sinister things. Sinister, that sounds like something evil. And the only one in this room who has indicated that we were evil is the defendant. When he spoke to Detective Greiner, said pure evil. What does that mean? Well, 2 kids don't just leave this earth and they're not be evil. There was some mention about the ATM, and I'll let you view that evidence and be the judge of that. How many people stop short of the ATM and get out? It's reasonable. He didn't want anybody to see that he had the kids with him, because he knew at that time he was going to get the money and he was going to kill the kids. The decision was already made. The Ed Johnson comment or thought, you can watch that video. Ed Johnson says it was Thursday. He said it was Thursday. He asked him, going on a long weekend. Said it was Thursday. The video from the other neighbor is Friday. Ed Johnson said he was in the driveway. He was walking up the driveway when he had the conversation with Adam Price. You can see on the Friday video, there's nobody talking to Adam Price. And there's nobody in Ed Johnson's driveway. And there's the exhibit in there that shows they're right next to each other. So it was Thursday. It was Thursday when he said he was going on a long weekend. And that's all part of his plan. The standards in terms of Dr. Berg and his autopsies, and that he was too busy. He did the autopsy in May. He didn't author the report till September because he was waiting to see if law enforcement identified anything. There's no rush about it. May to September, there's nothing rushed about that. Mr. Striggins said that in the course of their marriage, they had some disagreements, and those disagreements were disagreements about the children and time with the children. Exactly. There were disagreements about the children and time with the children. And Mary indicated she wanted to change her time with the children. And Adam said, I think about it. And because of that disagreement, Mary has no more time with her children. She will never have time with her children again. Dr. Berg, I wasn't watching Dr. Berg's eyes with the kids in the 2-room, I'll be honest. I don't know that he perked up or not. I do know that conversation about where the kids were was in relation to the carbon monoxide poisoning. And that he indicated that he had done the CO2 testing on Emily, but not Theodore. But there was no need to do it on Theodore, because if they were in the rooms next to each other, if it was in a level sufficient to cause Emily's death, it would have caused Theodore's death too. In Dr. Berg's opinion as to the ultimate cause of death, he gave that opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Sure, there are unknowns. There are unknowns. He said, if there's a toxin, I have to know the toxin before I can say that their death was the result of a toxin. He also talked about that there weren't any findings in there that suggested there was a toxin. He examined the lungs, he examined the gastric contents, and if there was a toxin that was ingested, he would have likely smelled it. But think about this. This toxin is a red herring. Because remember, he said he killed his kids. If he killed his kids by an unknown toxin that we're never able to identify, he still did it. He still had to have done that. He still would have formed the intent to give it to them and kill them. And then I'll just end with this. Mr. Sturgeon said that there's no doubt that Adam Price and Mary Price loved their kids. That's what he said, that they loved their kids. And I will say this. To say that Adam Price loved his kids brings whole new meaning to the phrase, loved them to death. Because that's exactly what he did. He planned it, he killed them, and he loved them to death. Because of that, he's guilty of first-degree murder, and I ask that you find him guilty of first-degree murder with respect to Emily Price and Theodore Price. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trout. Thank you, Mr. Trout.